Hey, Michael. Hey, Dan. I think we're live. I think we're good to get going.
All righty. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Grayson. I'm here with the Denton Black Film Festival, and today we're doing a presentation with Panavision, where we're going to be talking with Aaron Safa, the manager in FP for Panavision, and Dan Saski, who is the VP of Optical Engineering with Panavision. We're going to be talking about Panavision lenses and all that goes into what Panavision has to offer as far as lens choices and how that will affect your filmmaking decisions and choices. Let's go ahead and bring you guys in. Dan and Aaron, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I just get to say a quick word before. Thank you, Michael, and I want to thank the DBFF for having us. I'm really just here to say a quick hello. They gave me a moment to talk about the new Filmmaker program, the NFP, before Dan Sasaki comes up and does his amazing presentation about our optics. I just wanted to let everybody who's watching know that the new Filmmaker program is here to offer outreach and support and access to the community of independent filmmakers. And I wanted to invite you to check out the new Filmmaker program. You can access it online. And I wanted to most importantly give you our email, which is nfp@panavision.com. Pretty easy to remember, nfp@panavision. Actually, Agatha, if you want to throw that in the chat, I don't think I have access to the chat, but you can certainly do that. We do educational seminars, we do training. We also have a grant program where we do give grants of Panavision camera equipment for shoots, and we have a post-production grant as well through our post partner Light Iron. So I just wanted to make you all aware of that. I hope to hear from you all, and I hope when you have a project shooting. And I'm going to hand it over to Dan Sasaki so he can let you know a little about our lenses. So thank you very much for being here today, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Sasaki, and I'm the Vice President of Optical Engineering at Panavision. I've been with Panavision probably, a little over 30 years. I've seen many changes, especially from the change from film to digital. And what I've really noticed is that the authorship of the most recent changes is really coming into the skills of cinematography are almost kind of going through a sort of renaissance. And the selection of lenses and what lenses can do to help break down a digital camera have really kind of blossomed and have become the, I guess, the for lack of better words, the new film stock or the new way of really kind of differentiating one project from another. So basically that kind of primers us and leads us into the topic name of our presentation. Every lens has its story. And what that really does is explains what characteristics would you see in different series of lenses. And again, we don't want to predicate this entirely on Panavision because there's this amazing selection of lenses out there these days, much greater than I've ever seen of my career at Panavision. And we want to emphasize it and really kind of explain what different types of characteristics you can find in different series of lenses. So with that being said, let's start with the presentation. Okay, so okay, can everyone see the presentation slide? Okay, I guess we'll just assume that is yes, and we'll do it as we kind of spoke earlier. It's every lens tells a story, and what we want to do is how we use optics to kind of really help you tell the story and really separate your vision and authorship of imaging from someone else's. So what we're going to do is we're going to start looking at just 4 real basic images, and these are 4 very different types of lenses, all basically the same focal length, except for the one on the very far right. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay.
I did hit the share button. Yeah. Let's see here. Share. Let's set. Share. So I'll choose this one. Sure. Let's try that. And now are you seeing that, Aaron? Okay. Well. That's what I did. That's exactly what I did. Share screen. And then I'm choosing my entire screen. Share. Sharing your screen. You see, what are you seeing right now? Just the camera. Okay.
That was me.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. Okay. That sec. And share screen. I think we need option for audio. Entire screen. Share. I want this. Maybe you should try your other screen. I want this screen. You know what, Dan? Let's try that. I think that might be what's freaking it out.
HUI, right?
I think it might be freaking it out. Let's just do it. Let's see. You won't be able to see the next slide, but let's try that. Okay, so now we're seeing. I want to see this. I want to see. So I'm still seeing that. I want to see this. It's not showing. See, because now if I go here to the presentation is here, if I hit play, how much of a delay is there? See, it's still looking at the camera. Okay.
We'll just stop the sharing and go back and start it again.
That sounds good. Yeah, that sounds good. Sorry, Aaron. I'm doing everything it's saying to do. All right, I'll hang up. All right, bye. It's gonna have Alexis comment. I don't know who that is. Must be in.
Where'd you stop it?
Looks like we're still having a few technical difficulties. Please bear with us.
Well, Michael, I will tell you this is definitely this is hashtag COVID problems. I'm gonna see, just to help out the process a little bit, if it's possible for me to share my screen, because maybe that's gonna be somewhat helpful in determining what they're doing and or not doing. So let me just see if I can pull up a presentation as well here. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna try to share my screen too, since you all can see me, right?
Yes.
Okay, let's see if this does anything. Share screen. Okay.
Somewhere in the middle, the ones that are going to, the ones that get all the work, 100 millimeter lens.
Okay. Yeah, so I can see that it's trying to, but it's not working for me either. Huh. Let's see. Interesting. So whoever's doing this in the back end, I can see that my screen is trying to share, but it's not actually visible in the feed apparently. So I don't know if that makes a difference to anything that you guys are doing. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't seem like we're going to have much luck with the screen share here, unfortunately. I'm not sure. Let's see where that leaves us, but I don't know, Agatha, in the back there, I'm wondering if maybe there's a setting that's on. Oh, look at that. How funny. I don't know what just happened.
Is that your screen, Aaron?
That is indeed my screen. Not sure what just changed there, but everyone can see this, right?
Yes.
All right. Well, while they're figuring it out there, I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit more about the new Filmmaker program. Why don't we see maybe first if if now that, actually before I do that, I'm thinking, why don't we go ahead and just see if that helps Tommy, and Tommy can do this. So, all right, Tommy, why don't you come back in and let's see if maybe now that I was able to share my screen that it worked for you.
All right, we are. Can you hear us?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so let's try again. Share screen, and then I'm choosing my entire screen. Share. Okay. You're still okay.
There you go.
I think it's gonna work. Maybe.
Now you just got to select the other screen. You got to select the other screen that has the presentation
great.
on
Let's
it.
see if this works now.
There you go. That's looking much better.
This is a good sign. Okay, now we're going over to, yes, this is a good sign.
Okay.
Well, I will just say to whoever has hung on through all this, thank you very much, and
Thank
it will
you.
definitely be worth it. You're all very fortunate to have Dan here talking about lenses with you today. So I'll be quiet now and let them do it.
You can
You
hear
all
us
set there, Tommy?
You can hear us, right?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, cool. Dan's ready then. Sorry though.
All right.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. So I guess what we could do is kind of start with the first slide. And what we have here is an image of 4 different types of lenses. Basically all the same focal length. In case of the very far right, it's 100 millimeter anamorphic. So we're actually seeing a wider field of view. So there is a focal length change. But within this image or these tile of images, you're going to see very obvious changes in the aesthetic, being with more flare, apparent sharpness, with the glare, the amount of roll off in the bokeh, and all these are the type of characteristics we're going to talk about that are kind of unique to any type of lens or different type of lens that you might purchase, being a vintage lens or a modern lens. And within those lenses, we've identified 5 fundamental attributes that an average person can actually see. And you don't have to be an expert in lens technology or a cinematographer director. We've done this and found out that these attributes that anyone can see by asking normal people, such as the janitors, the people that come in as guests, the people that supply our vending machines, and how to look at footage. And we found out there's 5 different characteristics, which are spherical aberration, which is basically the softness of a lens, bokeh, the way a lens rolls off and how it appears when it looks out of focus, your flare, the way something handles, the lens handles the way a source of light, glare, the way a lens handles the scattering of that light, and color. And with color, we're not talking about necessarily being at sepia tone, black and white, or color, or being a color like RGB. We're talking more about how does the lens fall in and out of focus with respect to color, meaning does it have an absolute change from in focus, out of focus without any color, or is there kind of a color associated to that out of focus change? So we're going to basically kind of go and explain each type of those aberrations with an actual live photo or a moving image. And here's spherical aberration. So we're going to start off with a very sharp lens, or what we call a mathematically accurate lens, as our kind of reference point. And now we're going to look at a lens that has more spherical aberration, or what we'd call more softness with it. And you can see already that the palette has become changed, and this is due by inducing more fall off between the edge of the glass to the center of the glass. And you can see that you can't see the hair quite as easily with the softer lens, where on the sharper lens, you can count almost every strand of hair. With the softer lens, you can do a side-by-side. You'll just see that the softer lens has a much gentler roll-off between facial features. There's no really hard line between the foreground and the background. And some of the differences that people notice when we use a very sharp lens, it's really great for enhancing depth of field and giving a much more sensational image. And then by using the more vintage or the softer lenses that have more spherical aberrations, we tend to see an image that has more roll-off, where sometimes people would say it looks more rounded, and some people describe it as having a more three-dimensional effect. It's very kind of subjective, but the effects are there that the average person can see it, and that general softness is something that different types of lenses will give you. Next will be bokeh. And bokeh is the quality how a lens goes from in focus to out of focus. The transition, right now we're using an anamorphic lens because I think an anamorphic lens really showcase showcases how an image go from in focus to out of focus, meaning a point specular source will start as its source, but as we rack focus, it actually draws out and becomes a different shape. Interesting enough, bokeh also is different from different types of lenses. Some bokehs will actually demonstrate the amount of corrections within that lens. So you can actually get bokeh that's not necessarily round or elliptical, but actually has shapes that reflect the kind of aberrations that are occurring with that lens. What's interesting about it, it creates kind of a really nice transition that really evokes your audience's attention because it's looking at something that has a kind of a unique shape to it. What's also interesting, as the bokeh racks between its in focus and out of focus shape, it actually draws your attention by evoking your orienting response, which is kind of a flight or fight response that we're born with. And so when we see quick movement, especially with the luminance change, we're actually drawn to it. Next is flare. Now, flare is kind of a reflection with internal elements. The way you can really tell a flare from a glare, which we'll talk about next, a flare, you can actually pencil or outline the light source. What's interesting about a flare is actually a really great orienting response because it actually is a luminous change. And as humans, we are programmed to pick up on luminous changes. When we see something that's brighter than the foreground that changes almost rapidly, we're drawn to it. So a flare really brings your audience's attention. I've heard cinematographers say that they'll use flares as a way to kind of add some interest or texture to a part of the frame that's not necessarily interesting or has not a lot of information in it. The next is glare, which is kind of a second cousin to flare. Glare is more of a scattering of the light within the internals of the lens. So the light bounces off the external of the non-optical elements or part of the optical elements and scatters, where a flare is actually a redirection of those lights and a concentration of or a near focused image of what's going on within the elements. So a real easy way to tell a difference between a glare or a flare is a flare. Again, you can pencil it out. You can see in this example with the flare on the Underground Railroad sample that the little disc that's off to the side that has kind of a round with a comet tail, I can actually outline that with a pencil. The glare is that kind of non-uniform source that's around the sun, but there's really no border. And that's where we can say that's the glare because there's no really border I can identify, where the flare actually has a border and an outline I can pick up. And the next is color. So in this example from Phantom Thread, the color, you really see it in the tree line. And you can see within the trees, there's this kind of magenta color to it when you're racking in and out of focus. So many times with the color aberrations, if you're short of your image or your object, what you're going to see is it tends to have kind of a greenish color. If you're focusing deep or past the object, it'll go into this magenta color. And what's really interesting with that, in the photo emulsion days, the axial color was really kind of a no-no. But in the digital era, where the emulsion layers are set laterally or side by side, the kind of pollution or contamination that axial color creates is a kind of a natural softening effect. That kind of, it adds a little bit more personality and adds a little bit more depth and a more organic roll-off to kind of elevate the fact that this image is three-dimensional. So kind of go over what we just talked about in photo emulsion, which is in our top left hand, you'll see that the layers are stacked axially, meaning that they're from top to bottom, where your blue is on the very top layer and red at the very bottom because of the wavelength of the blues being the shortest. So the blues generally hit sooner than the reds. Now on a digital sensor, the CFA or their color filter array is actually lateral, meaning it's left to right. So what's different than that is if you look at our eyes have evolved to the point that we're accepting light that work axially. So a digital sensor actually picks up light laterally, which is a little contrary to our brain expecting to see something. So by contaminating something with a lens with a little bit more axial color, many times it's something that we can associate more. And the secret to something that's easily associated is if our brain sees something, or eye-brain combination is something that how we observe it in natural life, we spend less time analyzing why it doesn't look right and more time of saying, okay, this is how it should look, and enjoy the story more. So the fact that by adding a little bit of axial color into a digital camera that has lateral or left to right color arrays, it actually breaks down the kind of the digitalness of it and give it a more kind of organic sense. Okay, so let's kind of review those basic aberrations. Spherical aberration, which is basically the overall softness of the quality of the lens. And you can see, and this is an excellent example with an anamorphic lens, that an anamorphic lens is a little bit softer, or it tends to be. It's definitely not out of focus, but you can see the detail, but not counting every hair strand. We have chromatic aberration, which is, again, our axial color. And you can see within the background, there's a kind of a color fringing around the lights. And that is the color, axial color, that's polluting the CFA on a digital sensor and helps break up the distance between the foreground and the background. Our flare and glare, if you look in the very top with that light source, the flare is our horizontal and diagonal streaks, and our glare is that kind of bloom, or this kind of bluish color that kind of flutes into the actress's hair, and that's the glare. And the glare is really nice because it's kind of, again, it's kind of like optical smoke, so it kind of hides some of the imperfections in the scene and enhances the fact that this object is three-dimensional. In bokeh, and you can see here in this anamorphic, even though it's static in its final state, you can see the bokeh starts to ellipticize. What's really interesting about that is if something, as a cinematographer, your goal is to make something interesting to your audience. And if something, when it goes out of focus, still has a shape that is relatively reminiscent of it when it's in focus, there's a tendency for us to dwell on that and stare at the out of focus and try to figure out what that object is. Now, if we distort the bokeh, either being anamorphic or by using, say, a lens that falls off in a very non-round manner, the object becomes so out of focus many times that your eye will look at it, dismiss it, and concentrate on the object that the cinematographer and director intended you to be in focus with. So those 5 characteristics are really kind of the key fundamentals that we would say are born into every type of lens. Each one's a little different, and we're not saying one's right and one's wrong, but they give you very interesting palettes or differences in palettes that really separates your authorship of the image that you created. Now, here's from the Underground Railroad, and here's an excellent example of using a lens to bring out all those aberrations in a very purposeful way, in a way that maybe you're not necessarily going to see in a stock lens. And this is where we gently pull these aberrations out by using a lens that's a little bit different. So you can see here the flare, which is identified. You can actually pencil out the colors. And in this case, we actually induced the rainbowing. You can see kind of the flare from the iris right next to the gun stock at the very back. On the glare, you can actually see off to the very far right. The glare is not only lifting and creating this kind of pollution within the object, it's also separating into its component colors, which is, again, color separation or the color aberrations are something that's really interesting to our eye. It's a nice palette, and it also adds a little bit of interest in the texture, and that's in the chromatic aberration. The spherical aberration is born in this lens. This lens has a little bit of softness already built into it. So if you look at the foreground and the background, there's not a point where you can accuse this image of looking like your main character has been cut out with scissors and stuck to the screen, which sometimes can happen if you use a combination of lenses and camera systems that are too sharp. And that can be a very desirable option, but in some cases we don't always necessarily want to have the most optimal sharp image. We want something with a little bit more painterly, with a little bit more roll off in it. So that comes down to is how do we achieve that? So if we look here, we have 2 different lenses. We have one in the very top that has multiple elements. And imagine each element or each surface element, I can eliminate 1 aberration, or each bending of the element, that is. And I have a basic necessity of eliminating at least 7 aberrations and correcting for a focal length. So I need a minimum of 3 elements to make a lens that's acceptably sharp. And if you look at the bottom, that's basically what a Tessar lens is. I have 8 surfaces, and all these surfaces can correct the aberrations to an adequate amount. So the very beginning of the Tessar, it'll give you this kind of rudimentary image which is not perfectly sharp, but it has kind of a different feel to it, where it almost looks kind of, a lot of times we'll call it antique or vintage, where the lens on the top is a very perfect lens. We reproduce every detail. It's almost what we call a mathematically perfect lens. It's great on lens charts, but sometimes on faces it tends to pick out pores or hairs or flaws in. What happens if you have a lens that's very sharp? What happens is that things tend to look sometimes what we'd say is maybe synthetic, looks a little bit binary, doesn't look organic, or different roll-off. And part of that comes down to the fact that as humans, we tend to have this combination set in our brain that there's a certain threshold of sharpness that's acceptable to us. If we exceed that sharpness level, we'll say that lens looks too sharp, it looks kind of synthetic. If it's too soft, it looks still, we're saying that things aren't quite in focus, it looks mushy. So we want to find that kind of great balance. So we'll start off with in the days when photo emulsion was the main capture. We found that when we used older lens technologies, that sometimes film, because every time you process film, it go to another level of processing. And that next level of processing would take the quality down another step. So film had this natural way, not only that it has that kind of organic feel that people kind of associate film with, but every process step of film, the overall sharpness of the image would drop a little bit more. So what happens in some of these older vintage lenses, we'd find that the images became too soft by the time we finally went to the negative, to all the different steps, and then we finally took it to a projector, which may or may not have been in focus. There was projector weave. The lenses there kind of took it down and made the image kind of not as sharp as some cinematographers wanted it to be initially. So we did is we invented these modern lenses that were very sharp. And what it did is the extremely sharpness or the mathematically correctness of these lenses actually offsetted this kind of cascading softening effect that film had. And so when you finally saw your film image in the theater on a big screen, it kind of brought this kind of average down where it was back down to this visually balanced level. That was kind of the trend that as film, we started seeing these really sharp lenses like the Primos and the Master Primes and the Summilux Cs being developed that really had this incredible sharp MTF that offset the staggering effect of film. But once digital came out, digital didn't have this cascading effect because digital, what you saw in your first generation remained exactly the same in the second generation. So there was no cascading. So when I shot something digitally and put this extremely hyper sharp lens onto this digital camera, the effect came out and said, wow, I'm not getting this cascading effect. And similar to the example we had, things sometimes look hyper sharp. Another thing that happened too when digital first came out was many of the camera manufacturers and display manufacturers were saying that the difference between super sampled NTSC and early HD really wasn't that big of a difference. So to really make it saleable to the customers when they went to their store to buy a new monitor or camera, is they did something called edge sharpening. And what the edge sharpening did is it actually made the contrast stronger between your foreground and background. So the HD became artificially sharper to really make sales more appropriate in the post-consumer or the consumer end. And as a result, when we photograph things on these lenses, our cameras that actually edge sharpened and put a sharper lens on it, we actually got over almost an hyper sharpness. And things really started to look kind of synthetic. Things fell off a little bit too rapidly. It looked very flat. It was hard to tell if something was in the foreground or the background. It almost looked like many of your subjects were cut out with scissors literally and stuck to the front of the screen. So what happened is, I remember specifically examples of this with early digital. Cinematographers came in frustrated by saying we can't put too many stockings in front of lenses, we can't use too many diffusion filters because the diffusion filters telegraph themselves in the bokeh. The stockings, you can see the grid of the stocking in the bokeh. So they said, let's try some of these older super speed lenses, some of the lenses without as much correction. And sure enough, when you wet those onto the digital camera, it kind of brought them down and created this nice kind blended field that wasn't as sharp. And what happened was the natural aberrations within the lenses was kind of breaking down the natural sharpness of these digital cameras. What's really interesting though is that in the back of our head that we're using these vintage lenses, the fear was, well, the lenses back in the vintage era, they were really bad. They were vignetting, they were overly soft, they distorted off the edges. We can't use digital lenses. They have too steep of an angle. They're not hitting the digital sensors. We're getting too much portholing. Well, the reality is the lens technology and lens design is very mathematical. So even back in the 1900s, early 1900s, lens designers knew how to make a perfect lens. The fact of the matter is technology had not caught up with the ability to grind elements to the precision they needed that their calculations said. There wasn't enough substrate differences in glass elements to give them that color separation that their calculations said they needed to have. They weren't able to grind elements that are spheric or have non-round shapes to correct for the spherical aberration or the distortions. And the realities are in the lenses, for instance, on this show Safety Last with Harold Lloyd, this is a true vintage lens. And you can see in the difference between this shot and way down east with Lillian Gish, there's a very dramatic difference between the two images. Well, what it was cinematographers were smart. They knew that the lenses back then actually were capable of creating pretty decent quality images. The effects you've seen here were choices by cinematographers. They chose to create the vignetting. They chose through diffusion in their matte boxes to create the softness. When in reality, they knew they were fighting lenses that created images like this. So the vintage lenses really weren't that soft. And a really good example was once we did a show called The Artist. And the cinematographer thought, well, I'm just going to use the same lenses from the same era, but I'm going to use modern cinema photo emulsion and modern cameras. But since the lenses are from that era, I'm going to automatically fall into place. And we warned the cinematographer, no, that's not necessarily the case. The lenses back then actually weren't that bad. And now that you wed this with a modern film stock like Vision that has a really strong contrast, and then you're going to digitally scan it, you're going to be surprised it's going to look really modern. He says, oh, no, we'll be okay. They shot their test, and sure enough, they came back and says, wow, everything does look very sharp. So we had to go in and take the lenses and actually do what's called double the effect rule. So what happens is that we've ingrained ourselves or taught ourselves through memory or training through mass media that the vintage lenses have an effect much stronger than actually was in vogue or actually being captured then. So in the case of The Artist, we actually took the vintage lenses, induced more vignetting, induced more astigmatism or fall off, and made the lenses softer to offset this kind of pseudo-digital era where they would scan the film. And that kind of gave them that kind of vintagey feel. But some examples of this are, with the double effect rule, we're looking at a show called News of the World. This was shot by Derek Wolski on modern digital cameras, and the lenses literally used in the show were from the 1940s and 1950s. So you would have thought, wow, these lenses really are going to have kind of a natural softness to it. But Derek knew that by using the more modern capture format of a digital camera, he was going to offset the overly vintagey feel of the 1950s and create an image that was, I wouldn't say it's overly vintage, but it's not modern day sharp. It was kind of a nice mix where you can see within the example, you have a nice softness. You can see the kind of color blending, which enhanced this kind of really ethereal morning or silhouette of the clouds, enhancing the colors that you'd see in the sunset or sunrise. You see some of the flares off to the left. The fall off is really gentle, and at no point do the objects look like they've been cut out and pasted to the screen. They actually look like they've been inserted into the screen, so there's more of a three-dimensional feel. In the case of Good Lord Bird, you can see here when Albert Hughes came to us, he was saying he really wanted to emphasize the fact that when he looks at Civil War pictures, he saw the fall from the center of the edge. He really wanted to enhance that. Yet the lenses that he was using for this didn't produce that kind of feel that he saw when he remembers in grade school of these Civil War photos or these old pictures where the lenses back then were just simple landscape lenses that only had one element, which wasn't enough to cover all the aberrations. So we did the double effect rule and induced more astigmatism, which you can see on the left and right on the edges in it looks like the church. You see kind of a really nice natural softness, the vignetting, which can be done in post, but we actually induced it within the lenses first. We create a little bit more softness, and this came out by using with a softer lens and actually softening even more. And that's something that's really interesting for you young cinematographers and directors, is go ahead and play with your lenses and don't be afraid to experiment by adding, diffusion in front of your lens. Like try putting fishing line in front of your lens or behind the lens, or put plexiglass and melt it with your with a blowtorch and warp the glass and see what kind of really interesting effects you can create on the edges, and using different materials like photographing through a glass of water to get the color distribution, play with the lateral color and the color dispersion effects of using different mediums. Now we're looking at Diary of a Teenage Girl, which was shot with anamorphic vintage. And here the lenses, we allowed the coatings to lift and cause more of a glare. So you can see there's this kind of lift between the entire frame. You have the beautiful bokeh roundness of the out of focus of the trees, which aren't distracting, but become kind of part of the palette that really kind of frames out the main character. You can see the glare helps separate the character from the foreground and background. So all these characteristics, the spherical aberration, the more natural softness of the lenses, and then the glare and the flare characteristics actually help enhance that image and create a more three-dimensional palette. So let's kind of review that again. Let's look at a really simple example of a Primo 70, which we would call a mathematically perfect lens. You can see here that everything is fairly sharp. It almost looks like the subject's been cut out with scissors, that you can count every follicle of hair, almost to the point where the subject looks like she's been stuck to the front of the screen. The lights almost aren't very descriptive where they are in space. Now let's look at a more vintagey lens here, or a different type of lens, which is the 8 series. You can see now by choosing a lens that has something that's from maybe 20 years earlier, which are very easy to find nowadays, that you can see now she has a much softer feel to her. The hair is not as sharp. Now, again, we're not saying one's better than the other. It's very different, and it creates kind of a different way of describing different emotions, where this one is a much more clinical, it could be more futuristic feeling, and using this as a contrast as being a little bit more vintage or more of a period type lens. We see quite a bit is using different vintage or eras of lenses in the same movie that help either create a different tone to describe a different character, or describe a different time era or a different timeline. So if you want to go back and forth by creating effects with very strong difference in bokeh, where the bokeh here is very round and the bokeh on this lens has actually kind of a gumdrop shape to it, you'll notice that it creates something that doesn't stand out and scream, but it's something subconsciously your audience picks up on and helps enhance the fact that there's a different timeline or there's a different character being described. Okay, so if we can look at top and bottom, now when you see them side by side, once we did, the differences are very obvious. But you remember, you only have about 5 seconds between takes nowadays, that the changes have to be profound enough that the audience isn't going to have time to search around and look for these changes. So many times the DPs will say, let's do it with a little bit more purpose, because they know those effects that you've added are not going to be on there for very long. And the audience needs to resonate or actually identify with them in a really short period of time. So here's a really great example of exactly what he's talking about. We're seeing a generational change in lenses from the most modern, of which maybe a technology of 2015 to 2016, which is your Primo 70s, all the way down to literally 1940s, which is number 6, your standard speeds. And everywhere in between fits somewhere in between in that timeline. And you can see generationally the type of differences that how the glare is handled. the flares handle, the overall softness, the bokeh, if you're looking at the out of focus light sources, how they all react differently and have different shapes. This is all generationally different, and it has largely to do with how many elements are within the lens, how the designers decided to layer those elements, and in many times is how do we want to provide a lens to the customer. And you'll see that for the most part, these are just lenses that are off our shelf. You have 6 very strong looks. So you don't necessarily always have to go for the latest and greatest to create that look that you want. Really enhance and relish in the fact that you have more choices now than ever, I think, in the motion picture community, especially now with the availability of large format, small format, Super 35, these small portable cameras that actually take these lenses, you know, like the Blackmagic cameras or your SLR cameras, your DSL cameras. They all have the ability to take these lenses. They all have a really unique way of providing something that really gives that cinematographer and director a unique way of telling their own story. And what's interesting by playing with the different combinations, it's almost impossible to fall into the same look over and over again, especially when you relish on the fact that the art of cinematography is almost being reinvented because there are so many options out there that you have to really go back to the very beginning of the discipline of metering your light or using your lights, bracketing your light ratios, and not just light by monitors. Actually look at the ways of cinematography, because the techniques that were used back in the 70s and 80s, and apply those to modern day, because it really helps to separate yourself. So the lens is just one of the tools of the many tools that are within the cinematographer and director's arsenal. The perspective angle, your set designs, the filtration, the different types of lighting you use, what you do in post and what you do in previs, all really influence the image. And by using the lenses is one of the many ways of helping create a unique look. But again, really look into your craft and the ways that were used in the past, because you really can create an indelible look that can't be erased in post. It really holds itself through the imaging chain, and you can identify with it no matter what size the device I'm going to look at it is between an iPhone or a big screen. It has a look that's identifiable. So let's talk about design variety in this inventory we're speaking about. So Panavision was in a really unique position since we started in the 1950s, but what was interesting, during our startup, we did purchase a large inventory from the MGM lot, or the vaults. So we have lenses that range from the 1910s all the way to modern day 2000s, 2020s. We're always constantly developing lenses. And in fact, this slide here, we're already missing 2 series of lenses that were just developed in the last 2 years. There's also a couple more missing, but it just shows you that the combination is ever increasing. And the accessibility is much greater than you might suspect it is. So don't automatically dismiss it that, oh, it's Panavision, I won't be able to have access to these lenses. In fact, much of our inspiration comes from the students that have used our equipment and gave us feedback saying, hey, what if, can you do this to our lens? Many inspiration comes from the young students just by playing with the lenses. And again, and if you have a certain type of lens, for instance, say you have an old vintage super speed lens, don't settle for just using the lens as it is with standard filtration. I really challenge you or charge you with playing by adding things in front of the lenses, which happens all the time. So you'd be surprised by what a glass of water in front of the lens can do, or taking a piece of plexiglass and warping it with a torch, what that can do, or going to your surplus store and buying old optical elements, or if you have an old lens laying around, take the elements out of there and hold them in front of the lens and just learn the beauty of light and how you can actually bend the light and actually create your own unique look with the lenses you have on hand. Some of the most beautiful movies I've seen done have been done with the cinematographer taking the lenses that we provided, and he adds a little bit of touch by doing really interesting things, such as putting fishing string in front of the lens or behind the lens to create kind of this, a glare or this kind of localized softness within the image. So how do we judge lenses? Because there's such a vast inventory, more times than not, there'll be MTF charts that you see in your magazines or your trades, or you'll see lens chart tests where you shoot your lens charts and you evaluate it, which to me is really cool. It's great. It tells us, yeah, the lens might have a tilt or the calibration's off, but it really doesn't tell me about the visceral kind of feeling or what's born in that lens. As far as I'm concerned, the motion picture industry, the art of cinematography, is based off the arts and sciences, where art is kind of leading science. There's a really fine line between the two. It's semi-divisible, but they're both dependent in cinematography or photography. And I've yet to see a movie win best cinematography or best picture based off lens charts. What it's going to come down to is, how does the lens react with real three-dimensional objects, especially ones that aren't perfect? Or how do I make something that's not perfect look more beautiful than it really is? And that kind of reminds me of how something that's as subjective as, say, whiskey. We don't judge whiskey by how much parts water and how many parts of oak ash or whatever they put in it. We judge it by the flavor or its tones, or its kind of how rich it is, or how light, or how bold. And I think in a very similar way, lenses can fall into that same type of judgment, based off high contrast to low contrast, from how sharp it is to how soft it is. And then on that, you can add, instead of notes of say, apple or pear, you can add notes of flare or glare, how much it lifts. So if you kind of attune a lens, especially when you talk to us, if you ever have a lens question, you don't have to talk to us in a technical. Talk about it in kind of a very organic, tangible way. If it's the more emotional, the better. The best thing you can do is cite an old movie. But the more technical it is, sometimes it pushes in a direction that doesn't necessarily give you the best looking lens. But if you're talking in notes of high contrast or lower contrast, or sharper or softer, with more flare, more glare, that's where it really starts to resonate, and we can really help you and direct you what type of lenses that you might want to use. And we might even direct you in lenses that you might have like laying around your house, like your grandfather's old SLR lens. You could tell us, yeah, I have this old Nikon 55T f1.2. And I was like, oh my God, that's an amazing lens. That thing is going to do this, this, and this. So really think of lenses not as so much technical, but think of more of this kind of artistic tool, like a paint that you're going to paint your palette with. And again, let's talk about the variety of spherical, of all these different lenses. We have the primos, which tend to be a little bit sharper, and we were shot with Black Panther and Wonder Woman 1984, and you can see that it was more visual effects. The tone of that movie was a little bit more sensational, and that helped describe, for instance, the Marvel and DC way of producing movies. And then we look at some of the supers and standard speeds, which are more of our vintage lenses, and those were used on the Lighthouse and Phantom Thread. The argument here is, okay, sure, Lighthouse and Phantom Thread were shot with photo emulsion, and Black Panther and Wonder Woman were shot with digital cameras. But actually, digital cameras with vintage optics are just as prevalent. It just happen to be these were the descriptions we used that came up. But this most recently, we just did a demonstration, for instance, with Kramer Morgenthau, who did Respect. We used vintage lenses to help on a digital camera to help convey the fact that you're putting into a different period of time. So by just kind of going over the spherical characteristics, the spherical, we're going to go over anamorphic next, but spherical has its own unique identity. By looking at the spherical aberration of Underground Railroad. What's really interesting on that is that it has a kind of an ethereal softness to it, but there's layers to it. So this is an excellent choice here, because it really shows between the foreground and the background. There's steps of what's in focus and what's out of focus, but it's not so dramatic that it's in or out. It actually has this really three-dimensional feel to it that almost accentuates this kind of the depth and the kind of the enormity of the set. The bokeh, in this case, is kind of a very strong, a very predicted round bokeh. as we saw earlier, that bokeh can actually go elliptical. It can actually take the shape that's even more pronounced than the kind of round ovals that you're seeing in this example. And again, that comes down to the lens. You'd be surprised if, for instance, if you ever have a lens, go and put a piece of camera tape on one side of the front of the lens, and you'll see you can actually start altering the bokeh and give it kind of an interesting texture. And what's fun about that is you could actually make the bokeh disproportionate, where it's not balanced, so that one side has, I don't know, you can make it jagged, and the other side a little bit more rounder. So it kind of has like a yin and yang effect, where there's this kind of opposition or a contrast between objects. The chromatic aberration, again, with phantom thread, within the trees, you actually see color coming in and out. And what that does is that color pollutes the image a little bit. It acts like by allowing the glare to kind of play with it, it accentuates the three-dimensional layering of what's in focus and out of focus, and brings out a more three-dimensional feel, or a more enhanced roll-off between what's in focus and out of focus. Our flare and glare characteristics, the flares, you can see the flares are obviously the little dots, which are representative of each element and what aberration is going on within that element. We have the glare, which is the kind of general lifting of our subjects, and kind of pushes the subjects into the screen and takes them away from looking like they're on top of the screen, which again enhances the fact that this is a more rounded, less flat scene with a little bit more depth to it. It gives it kind of sometimes a more romantic feel to it, something that's a little bit more nostalgic. So playing with flare and glare is really interesting. You'd be surprised at how far a little bit of nose grease goes on a front element to help create flare and glare. And I hear that being used quite a bit. In fact, the cinematographer Janusz Kaminski, when he does tests, a lot of times he'll test the lens and he'll add a little bit of grease onto the front element just to see how the lens reacts when he hits it with stronger light sources. So again, we saw that little tile. We're just going to kind of look at the examples. So the sphere collaboration, just notice how well layered it is. It almost looks like a swing and shift, where it has a really enhanced depth to it, but it's not. It's just a normal lens with a little bit more sphere collaboration that created layers. And that's by using lenses that don't have to have the most perfect ray launch. The bokeh, you can see here, it starts to go from a nice rounded shape. You can see the iris a little bit in the middle, where it has kind of a hexagonal shape. As we go off to the right of the frame, you can actually see that hexagonal shape starting to turn more elongated into kind of an elliptical shape. And actually, because there's a little bit of astigmatism in there, the bokeh actually starts to round and pick up kind of a rounding shape to it. In many cases, especially nowadays, we're asked to actually increase the amount of that bokeh effect, the fall off. The chromatic aberrations, this is a much better, the blow up. You can see the color within the trees. There's almost kind of a purplish color within the blacks of the tree silhouettes. There's kind of a purplish color on the outer edge of the silhouettes of the trees. And all this is used to help create kind of a separation between the foreground and the background. It's a natural softening effect that softens the lens without actually softening the lens. It's kind of this, it doesn't quite make sense, but it actually works if you think you're softening without softening. And the flare and glare, this is really a great example. You have a combination of both flare and glare. It's very easily identify the flare because I can draw a pencil around it. The glare has this kind of non-bordered way of lifting the contrast. And it's really nice because it kind of hides the images. It looks like optical smoke, and you can actually see the flares, and each object has its own shape to it, and each shape is kind of reminiscent of the aberration that's occurring within that lens at the time. Okay, so let's look at some other spherical characteristics which are equally important. We have on the left, it's called perspective distortion, and that's where you can actually see the angles. The linearity of it actually picks up enhanced angles. On the right is what's called geometric distortion, and that's fisheye or pincushion. What's interesting about these type of aberrations is perspective is unique to the lens type, how it's built. We can actually increase it or decrease it. And geometric, again, is do we want to correct for the distortions? Now, what's interesting about distortion, here's the counter distortion, is what's called pincushion, which is the positive. As a human being, we tend to we're attracted to the negative distortions. So we will accept barrel distortion before we accept a pincushion. We'll accept flares that go outward versus a flare that goes inward. And that's because, I think, largely it's because that's the way our eyes and brain pick up the images. What I've heard when we see pincushioning, many audience or cinematographers will say, it looks like it's being ripped apart. It doesn't feel natural. So you can use pincushion many times to create kind of a feeling of discomfort, because to us, pincushioning is something that's not very comforting. It's not natural to us, where barreling is more acceptable to us. Now, with perspective distortion is really interesting. You can see with a wide angle lens, I can induce a close focus because we're having such a wide angle lens pulling in the rays at a really non-parallel situation. The facial characteristics become enhanced or almost exaggerated, where the forehead becomes larger than normal, the chin becomes more normal, larger than normal, the nose becomes like it's closer and almost enlarged. Or a long lens, where the light's coming in more parallel, you can see things tend to become more normalized. But to the effect that's almost on the opposite, many times lenses that are too parallel actually begin to make things look fat. So this comes down to, again, with lens choices. Do I want to use a lens that has a modern telecentric, meaning the rays come in and out parallel to each other? Or do I want to use a lens that's more vintage or more classic design, where it has a steeper cheek ray angle? And here's a perfect example. Here is two lenses. We have a telecentric on the right and a fixed focal length with a traditional cheek ray angle on the left. If you look at the bottom, the setup is the cube on the right is actually further away than the cube on the front. Since the telecentric lens is making the rays all come out of the lens more or less parallel, the relative sizes of each other become the same, and it basically looks like the blocks are existing on the same axis. So it kind of hides some of the three-dimensional qualities of the object, which is great if that's what you want to do. You want to create compression or create a feeling of discomfort, or you need something that's very accurate reproducing the object matter, such as saying you're doing something that's with a lot of details or information that you want the audience to be able to read it equally well. But if you want to convey a feeling of depth, pick up a more traditional lens that has a steeper ray angle coming out. And now you can see, because of the steeper ray, we take advantage of what's perspective distortion, and what's in the foreground and the background become more exaggerated. So the actual distance becomes more telling of what's in forward or front and what's in the front and what's in the back. So again, choosing the area of lens, being a modern lens or a lens that's more vintage, is going to help convey the fact that one's going to make something look more perspective distorted and one's a little bit less perspective distortion. And that really helps to tell the story between what is something that's a little bit more perfect looking or something that has a little bit more depth to it. Now on the spherical large format, same thing. The only difference with large format, on the spherical large format, there's just a few more choices. With that, oops, excuse me 1 second. The large format lenses basically have the same rules. On the very top, the Primo 70s are very telecentric. They have really mathematically perfect images, and we go all the way to the vintage. It has a really softer look, the different bokeh. So we have equal amount of choices for large format as we do in the 35 format. And in the same way, we'll notice that we have, I like to judge them more like in this kind of whiskey chart format. And you'll notice that the lenses tend to descend from the top left-hand corner, which is the sharpest and high contrast, most contrast, to the lowest contrast and the softest. Now, we can always adjust the lens to go to the right. It's almost impossible to make a lens go from the far left into the far right, because I can make a sharp lens soft, but it's hard to make a soft lens sharp. You can do that by increasing the contrast, which is something more post. And what that really brings up the great question is, sometimes if I start with a softer lens, increase the contrast in post, I can actually get the best of both worlds. I get the softer kind of palette of hiding the hair and creating a nice smooth face with a lot of depth markers to it. But at the same time, I'm giving a more modern contrasty feel. So again, the combination of using your tools is almost limitless. So with the large format, there's multiple choices, and you can see how varied they are. The Primo Artiste, which is a modern lens with a little bit more bokeh texture to it. A little bit more spherical aberrations were used in shows such as Just Mercy or Midsommar. The Primo 70s, which are our most mathematically perfect lenses, are used on Coming to America 2 and SWAT. The 8 series, which are true vintage lenses, were used on Dune and the spherical parts of Dune, or Black Narcissus. The Vintage 65 News of the World, which we spoke about before, was using a true vintage lens and using a modern sensor and crushing it. He had a really nice balance between vintage and modern. The System 65, which were literally lenses from the 1970s type era technology, were used in Death of the Nile. And that was photo emulsion. So it gives you the combination that we talked about of that cascading MTF or sharpness level of film, with a lens of large format, made a really nice balance of image quality. IMAX used on Tenet was using both IMAXs and the Sphero 65, which is a fairly modern lens, but those were wetted with photo emulsion. So Hoyte knew that by using the softer palette of photo emulsion, he'd be able to achieve this really nice cascading effect. And then the Underground Railroad, which used a very modern Panaspeed that was actually softened to give you the feel of a more vintage lens. And that was a great option because he had the conveniences of a modern lens, being a faster f-stop, a better close focus, a consistent size, size for the assistant. But the look was created to make the lenses look more vintagey. So it had a more what James Laxton thought that something of that era would look like based off of he and his directors kind of planning. So we just talked about Super 35 and large format and the different types of lenses. And one of the biggest confusions, the seasoned cinematographers and directors is, well, what exactly is going on with these large format lenses? Or when I put the lens on a small format camera, does the focal length actually change? No, the focal length doesn't change. That's burned in the lens. A 35 millimeter is always a 35 millimeter. But what's happening is, imagine the format size of your sensor. As I go to a larger format, all we're doing is opening up the curtains. We're just allowing more and more to be seen. But the relative magnification or the focal length of the lens always remains a constant. So in 16 millimeter format, we're seeing, I will use this painting here as an example. Once I go to 35, I'm using you notice the subject is exactly the same size, but I did the equivalent of opening the curtain. I'm just seeing more information. The amount of depth of field so far is remaining the same. It's just the amount of field of view is changing. And as I go to 65 millimeter, I'm opening the curtain even more. But again, the relative size of the object's the same, and my relative depth of field is the same. Now, where the confusion occurs is, well then, why is it when I shoot on the relative same, relatively two different sensors, what are the main differences I'm going to see then if the focal length is the same? Well, since I'm using a smaller sensor, to get the same field of view, I'm going to use a tighter lens. But since I'm using generally on a smaller sensor, I'm going to be using a wider lens to get the same field of view, a longer lens. The main difference is your perspective distortion, the amount of angularity you're seeing, and relative magnification between your foreground and background. And that is the main difference that I see between large format and small format, is that when I shoot large format, for instance, shooting a full moon, the full moon looks basically about the same size as I see it with my eye when I'm looking outside. But if I shoot with an iPhone, the full moon becomes very small, almost to the point it's in competition with the stars if you're using too small of a sensor. Now, this is really interesting. If you think of a phone sensor, the size of the sensor relative to the eye is very small. Where you look at the human, the whole photosensitive part of the human eye is actually, if I unwrap it, becomes very close to the size of a large format sensor, i.e. a 65 sensor or a VistaVision. So that when we get closer to VistaVision or large format, the relative magnification, the perspective angles start to look more natural to us. So much so that when we go to IMAX, it almost takes on this hyper realism because it becomes actually larger. So we're seeing objects larger than we would actually perceive it in real life. So here's a real example of a full moon shot with a large format lens, and that's probably almost like hyper real, which is almost larger. Where on an iPhone, it looks much further, and that's one of the interesting things is that with large format, you really want to consider shooting with large format because sometimes unless you're really bringing out those type of facets, the large format sometimes is hard to identify. For instance, the movie Parasite, which was shot with the Alexa 65. It's very hard to find compelling images that shout out that this movie was shot on the Alexa 65. With the 65, with that movie, some of the characteristics of the perspective and the magnification that show has very traditional looking shooting styles where had I not been told ahead of time that it was shot like 665, I wouldn't have been able to point it out. Whereas if you watch a movie such as Tenet or some of the earlier IMAX movies that Christopher Nolan shot, you immediately identify that it was shot IMAX because in those cases, he was really taking advantage of the perspective and the relative magnification that's really realized by large format photography. So you can see the relative differences. So imagine when we go to a large format sensor, all we're really doing is opening the curtain. So here's kind of a live format of description or demonstration of what happens. The effective focal length, which is the EFL, or your 35 millimeter or 50 millimeter lens, remains the same. But as I go from 35 to VistaVision, which is like your 5D or your Sony A7, all I'm seeing is I'm seeing more information, which you can see on the left, which on the negative side or your image size just sees more. As I go to large format, I'm just seeing more, but my focal length remains the same. So in order to counteract seeing more and trying to give you the same field of view that you're used to in your standard Super 35, which seems to be the go-to de facto focal length standard, we move to a longer focal length lens. And that's where the confusion occurs, is that we're not changing the focal lens, we're optioning to use a longer focal length lens to get the same relative field of view that we've been taught in the 35 millimeter format world. So for instance, many cinematographers will say that their master wide is a 27 millimeter. Well, since if I put a 27 millimeter on a 65, I'm going to see approximately twice the field of view. So it's going to look almost like I'm shooting it on a 14. So when I go to 65, I'll reach for a 50 millimeter to give you the same field of view. Since I'm using a longer focal length lens in the 65, I'm going to have better control of perspective, meaning my angles aren't going to be as bendy. My relative magnification is going to be greater, so the difference between my foreground and background will be more compressed, and my depth of field will tend to fall off a little bit more rapidly. So here's kind of a really quick brief summary we're talking about. The wider angle lenses will tend to make faces look a little bit more distorted or thinner, where the longer lenses become, you notice the girl's face actually becomes a little bit wider, which is kind of interesting. One of the prominent Korean cinematographers was talking to me about when he shoots music videos for Korean pop stars, is that he has to be careful with lens choices because many of the Korean pop stars have really high cheekbones and round faces. And if you use too long of a lens that's telecentric, it makes them look really round and kind of weird looking. So he'll choose lenses with steeper, cheaper angles, which is like a more vintagey lens that tends to enhance the perspective distortion and make faces look narrower, and use lenses that aren't as long and go a little bit closer to the wider angle lens to kind of hide or mask some of the flattening effects that too long of a lens can create. Okay, so again, magnification and perspective are very powerful tools in helping identify, and every lens has a different magnification and perspective because that designer used that lens, the design of how he's going to exit those rays differently. So each one's going to tell a slightly different story. Now, let's kind of do a quick overlay between large format and standard format, and you'll see that we corrected the focal length. So obviously, if we're using a 25 millimeter and 35, we'd use a 50 in large format to kind of offset the field of view change. And you can see in large format, the foreground, background, the softness, the bokeh, the things we spoke about. Let's look at all those. In Super 35, you'll see that there's a magnification change. Your foreground and background automatically jump to a different position. One's closer or appears closer. My depth of field is different, the amount of roll-off. My perspective angles, for instance, of the wine bottles, have a different place to the point where the laptop actually covers it. So it creates a very different look. So effectively, Super 35, for instance, on Birdman versus large format on the Hateful Eight, which these two scenes were chosen because they have relatively the same object placement between your foreground and background characters, but it's very different. On the Super 35, which you tend to use a wider lens, closer focus, you'll notice that the Michael Keaton's facial, his features are become exaggerated. His nose becomes a little bit greater, forward pronounced. His forehead becomes a little bit longer. The person in the background, she has a little bit less distortion. Where on Hateful Eight, you'll notice that everything kind of just falls off in a very natural order. I'm not seeing too much perspective distortion. I'm seeing a greater fall off in depth of field because I'm using a longer focal length lens. Again, this is all can be influenced with the lighting. If I'm use soft lighting, sharp lighting, am I going to open the iris a little bit more and get less depth of field? But the geometry of the lens, the perspective distortion, if you look at the ceiling tile, is very exaggerated, the amount of angles, where on the Hateful Eight, if we had access to the ceiling tiles, it'd look more parallel. It would look closer to how our eye would probably see it. So now let's talk about anamorphic. So anamorphic is really interesting because anamorphic has basically two focal lengths built into the lens. You have a vertical focal length and a horizontal focal length. And what's interesting about that, the main difference is because of that, then the spherical on those 5 characteristics of the spherical aberration, bokeh, flare, glare, and color, is that the spherical aberration will be a little bit greater naturally. The bokeh is going to fall off much quicker because we're going to fall off with more astigmatism, meaning the verticals and horizontals are going to fall out of focus at different rates. The flare, obviously anamorphic, has an iconic blue line flare, but since there's more elements in anamorphic, we tend to see more flare. And since there's more elements in an anamorphic lens, we tend to see more glare. And since an anamorphic has a little bit more softness, there's more color aberration. So that helps enhance the softness of the lens. So again, by using our kind of whiskey chart reference, you'll notice that we go from the left all the way down to the right, and this kind of to the bottom right in this kind of sweeping curve. There's only really one outlier, really, is the G series lenses, which is kind of a really high contrast lens with a little bit more softness overall. But again, we can move everything over to the right. It's very hard to move everything from the left, but you can see by looking at different series, and this applies not just to Panavision's inventory, but even the inventory you have access to, it'd be interesting for you just to shoot tests and plot them into your own whiskey chart so you get to know the lenses and treat them as a function of high contrast versus low contrast, of sharpness versus softness. What's really interesting about anamorphic, though, is this about what kind of caught me off guard is how is it that anamorphic survived, even though at one point anamorphic actually was at a disadvantage to spherical when digital first came out. With anamorphic originally, you would capture the lens with anamorphic. It was on the largest piece of negative of film available, and you project it, you just stretched it out with a projection lens. When anamorphic was first captured digitally, what happened was the anamorphic lens was captured digitally, but in order to unsqueeze it in digital, we didn't project the digital lenses out with the anamorphic projection lens. We would subtract pixels from it vertically, which would actually compress the image down and unsqueeze the image. So in net, anamorphic was at a technical disadvantage because it had less resolution than spherical. And there was many prophecies that because of this fact that anamorphic was technically inferior to spherical, that anamorphic will be dead within 2 years. And this is, we're talking, 1990s, that, wow, anamorphic sounds way out. We're not going to see anamorphic lenses in the 2000s. When in fact the opposite came true. And that kind of got my mind thinking that what's making anamorphic have this lasting power? And largely that is because anamorphic really emphasized these 5 pillars of anamorphic. that we're going to talk about now, which are kind of similar to the pillars that we spoke about earlier about the 5 tenets of spherical, or what the audience can see, but anamorphic, they're a little bit enhanced. And what happened is, because these anamorphic lenses lent to an image with so much personality, that despite there was a technical lack of technology in anamorphic, the fact that there was so much personality in anamorphic that it actually prevailed and became stronger and stronger, because it helped break up the digital fill. And as digital sensors became more sophisticated, anamorphic started getting its technical advantage back. So these pillars are magnification perspective, disproportionate breathing, flare, bokeh, and focus roll off. Almost identical, but they just have different titles than we saw in spherical. So if we look at a spherical, this is magnification and perspective. Perspective, we remember we're talking about the converging lines and the relative size of information and how much we distort the face. Since we're using a longer lens in anamorphic, our proportions of our face tend to look a little bit more natural, where in the spherical, they tend to be a little bit elongated. The perspective, the angles of things going in and out of the foreground and the background tend to be increased. The lines converge more. And again, the amount of depth of field, the fall off becomes more enhanced. You see things fall off much sooner. So I'm forcing the audience, or my target audience, to pay attention to what I want to pay attention to and give something a little bit more natural. But you look at shows like Birdman, where they use perspective distortion quite successfully to really kind of tell the story. So I'm not saying one is better than the other. They just have very unique qualities that really help tell the story. Disproportionate breathing. If you look in this scene here, as the focus is racked between in focus and out, not only is there a focus rack where the verticals and horizontals go out of focus, there's actually a change in size between your foreground and background. What's interesting about that is some cinematographers absolutely hate this phenomena, but some just relish around and embrace it, because this movement actually creates an orienting response, or it evokes the orienting response, because if we see something move near the periphery of our eye, we're drawn to it to see if it's we have to take a flight or fight type of response. So the movement actually draws our attention. So that little bit of breathing is actually something that's of great interest to help draw your audience back in. And that's something anamorphic does. Panavision anamorphic lenses have focus breathing up and down. Some of the other anamorphic lenses out there, for instance, some Crystal Express or some of the older lenses, will have a horizontal breathing. But either way, that type of movement helps effectuates a gathering sense that our eye-brain combination really look for. The flare, obviously we were talking about flare. The anamorphic, because the elements are situated in a very directional manner, they're not perfectly round, they create flares that sometimes are horizontal. In this case, it's horizontal and diagonal, so it really enhances those flares. It gives you a luminance change. And as humans, when we see a luminance change, we're drawn to it because it's something that creates interest. It breaks away the monotony of an object. It creates something that looks a little bit, you can add as using texture or some type of prettiness to your image. So the flares of anamorphic kind of stand alone. There's many times we will put anamorphic elements or flare attachments to make spherical elements simulate that anamorphic flare. And the bokeh. The transition between the bokeh, you can see it becomes elliptical. It actually starts pulling the lights inward. It almost has kind of a bending shape to it. So when we rack from it being in focus to out of focus, it actually transforms the background into something different. It makes it a very interesting texture. It also hides the identity of that background to the point where it gives the audience something to look at that's interesting and also less distracting, so that you can either have them look more what you intend your audience to look at, or make something look a bit more prettier, almost impressionistic like. In the case here with Dune, you can see the bokeh without lights, how it affects it. It's not just something that affects specular sources. You can see the kind of the grass in the background, the dried grass, or it actually begins to swirl. It takes on a dimension where on the right-hand side, it actually is more orthogonal, straight up and down. As we move over to the left, the bokeh actually starts to go out of focus, and that's largely due to the astigmatism within the anamorphic lenses. Focus roll off, meaning, for the lack of better words, anamorphic lens tends to be a softer lens. And what we were talking about before, that softness sometimes breaks the foreground from the background. It gives you less of a defined line between the foreground and background to kind of resist that cut out with scissors look. And astigmatism, and that has to do largely with the fact that the horizontal and vertical of that lens are two different focal lengths. In the case of killing them softly, we actually pulled that out and embraced the fact that there's two different focus points. So much so that if you look at the telephone poles, which you know are straight, they actually begin to look like forks. The lenses created a split, which has made it even more impressionistic and took away from the foreground background. It created a much greater sensation of separation between the foreground and background, and enhanced the fact that there's a more three-dimensional quality of that image. This is something that we can do. Some spherical lenses do this very nicely. Lenses with more astigmatism in it. And distortion. Again, we're talking about geometric distortion. Barrel distortion is very much acceptable. Had we shot this scene with a lens with pincushion distortion, it would actually look almost eerie and uncomfortable. So sometimes you'll find lenses with pincushion distortion, and you find that using pincushion distortion is a great way of creating kind of an uneasiness within the scene. Okay, and we'll find out now that up to this point, we always thought anamorphic was something of a two-time squeeze phenomena. More now, we'll see that with digital sensors having different aspect ratios or native. For instance, the DXL sensor has a 1.89. A 1.3 squeeze gives you a perfect 240. And if you look at, for instance, your Sony Venice, that has a 1.5 aspect ratio. So by using a 1.65 squeeze lens or 1.85, you'll find that I can use the entire negative. So now anamorphic not only has those artistic attributes that we spoke about, but technically we're using more pixels than you could on a spherical. So by using anamorphic lenses, you'll find that you can actually manipulate more pixels and still get all these beautiful artifacts. So you're meeting this criteria that really helps drive this preservation movement that you're seeing from the streaming channels such as Netflix and Apple, and asking that you have to have a minimum pixel count because of archival reasons. Here's some examples of some anamorphic squeeze variations. We have 4 different types of squeeze ratios, and they've all been used recently in different types of shows. And all these are fairly new shows. The 1.3s were used in WandaVision, Rogue One, most recently also in a show called How Did They Fall. The 1.65s were used on Mandalorian, the first 2 seasons, Dune, and Mortal Kombat. You'll see the 1.85s were used on a show called Finch. They were used on Underground Railroad. You'll see that they were used as well in How Do They Fall in the up-and-coming Elvis movie that's coming out. And the 2X, the traditional, is used for No Time to Die, The Trial of Chicago 7, and Respect. Now, let's talk about why are we so worried about all these aberrations. It has largely to do how we see the world. And this is basically a really good representation of how our eye picks up the world, our brain combination, that is. So in the center of our vision has the most acuity or sharpness, and also has the best response to color. As we move off to the periphery of our eyes, our acuity becomes less. It's not out of focus, there's just not as many connections, so there's not as many photosites. So it's basically less resolution is available, but it becomes more monochromatic. So much so that our far peripheral vision is black and white. You don't see black and white naturally. Our brain compensates for it because we're constantly moving our eyes in saccades, and we're mapping a world within our brain. So probably the best advice is our eye looks, our brain sees. Your eyes are just basically a lens. The brain is actually processing the really kind of not the best images from our eyes. Now, if we look at here, you'll see that the reason for the lack of color vision is as we move off the periphery, there's not as many cones, and it becomes all rods. Now, the great thing about rods are the rods, which are only black and white, are great for motion detection and seeing things that move rapidly. So The black and white vision, so using the peripheral of our vision, or the black and white, the quick movements, the shaky cam, quick cuts, movement, flashing of lights, anything that is not dependent on color grabs our attention because that is part of the way that our eyes have evolved. So much so that we watched our theater experience in their days based off the way our vision. So our central vision was focused on the screen. Our peripheral vision, which was very easily distracted by flashes of light or movement, was generally blackened out by a dark theater. But now, so all those beautiful aberrations, we're scanning with our eyes with our color vision and detecting them, and we're seeing differences. But as we started moving to smaller and smaller screens, because now the unfortunate truth is more content is viewed on portable devices than theaters, that we're using a smaller part of our vision. So now our fovea, or central color vision, which is our best identifying of all these beautiful lens textures, is in competition with our black and white motion sensitive vision, meaning that whenever something is distracting movement off to the side of your eyes, something's brighter on the edges, we automatically have to look at it to try to identify what it is, and that takes away from our attention of the central screen, and all those really awesome aberrations and pretty lens choices you made are now in competition with a much stronger response. So what we do as a way to combat that is we actually enhance those aberrations. So that 2 times effect rule that we talked about with making lenses more vintage, many of the aberrations that we use are enhanced to make those aberrations stand out even more for a smaller screen size, and one that is more apt to be seen with disruptions or type of movements that might cause us to look the other way. Another very interesting thing is our eyes are constantly scanning what's called saccades. So all those aberrations are going to be looking for things that are most noteworthy. So if you look at an average eye, we look at their eyes, nose, mouth, and something that's luminance change, even in animation. So what we do is we notice if we tend to put those or pick lenses with aberrations that concentrate on the softness quality of the eyes, the softness or enhancement of the perspective of the nose and mouth, which is our perspective distortions, our bokeh, the relative fall off, or the luminance changes such as flare and glare, we tend to get to the point where our eyes are most interested in. So much so, even in animation or movies with subtitles are just as interesting to a viewer as they are as the real subject. So by adding text or luminous change, which is basically a subtitle, you're actually drawing your audience into a movie more and engaging it. And we're finding people that watch subtitle movies in conjunction to watch the movie, they tend to watch the movie with less distractions. So what is really important now is we want to really remember is your project is evergreen, because the landscape that motion pictures are going through is changing constantly. And I have to say, within my 30 years of work at Panavision, I've seen the most dramatic changes in the last 3 to 5 years. And it has a lot to do with the fact that we're viewing movies in a much smaller format. We're viewing movies with a much greater content is availability, so there's much more competition. So the way that you can foster your image is in greater competition. So you really want to enhance the fact that you have more choices than ever with lenses. You really want to take advantage of these changes. And what you learned today about what we see and what lenses can provide to actually stimulate your visual cues, really take advantage of them, because there's been platforms that haven't even been created yet. So remember, you really want to let every lens tell its own story. Embrace the fact that as cinematographers and directors, you have more choices of lenses than ever before. You have more choices of camera formats than before, and you really want to enhance it. That now you're probably in the best section or historical moment in motion picture capture that I can remember. You really want to take advantage of the fact that whatever you do, let it be your story. Don't have to follow anyone else's footsteps. Try different things. Put really weird stuff in front of your lenses. Don't be afraid to try your old camera you have back in the closet and put it in front of the camera, or adding extra elements to your lenses or different types of lenses, elements that you put in front of the lenses, or warped plexiglass, because it creates a different look that really is visceral and helps tell your story. Because remember, there is no right or wrong answer to art. What's really interesting in photography, there's no reality so subtle that it becomes more real in reality, which basically is, how do I create something in nature that looks more beautiful than nature, so that it helps really elevate the story that you're telling. And I think the lenses that you choose and the way you use them is one of the great ways or path leading to the ultimate image quality. And with that, I leave you with a thank you very much for listening to the presentation. And just remember, every lens tells a story, and use all your great cinematography skills that you're brought up and that were used in the past, because they have a great future now. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you. I'm just trying to get out of the thing here.
That was a great presentation, Dan.
Oh,
Really
thank
appreciate
you.
the insight and the expertise. We do have a few questions from the audience.
Of course, I'm ready. I'm just trying to get out of the screen here. I know there's a way. Do you know how to get back to the share? I know you showed me this. Oh, wait.
So I think the screen sharing is off now.
Okay, you can see me?
Yes, I can see
okay,
you.
Okay, I just
We're
can't
good to
see you
go.
guys. Okay, that's fine. So, please answer. I'm ready for any question you might have.
Great. The first question, I would just like to say, I love the tagline, "Every lens tells a story," and just based on the deck and the pictures and the presentation, that was very interesting and informative and educational. You know, I believe everybody got something out of that. I definitely did.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's more important than ever now that I can't emphasize enough that the lens choices out there are just incredible. The variation in lens designs is just immense. There's multiple combinations. So much so, if I had, for instance, 50 lens designers asked to create a lens, that they can only use 6 elements. It all had to be a 50mm f2. But go crazy, you're going to end up with 50 completely different designs and completely different ways of creating that 50mm, because there's such a unique way. And you really, as cinematographers and students of motion picture, really experiment with the freedoms and the choices you have nowadays, because just like there's multiple ways of telling a story, there's multiple ways of capturing the image of that story, and lensing is one of the key ways of getting you there.
Definitely. Now, I had one question before we get to the audience questions.
Okay.
I know you talked a lot about camera formats. Are there any major differences with camera mounts? Because we have so many different mount choices now.
Right. Okay. Well, the main thing I'm seeing now is that I don't know if the manufacturers are getting smarter, but what happened, or we're just accommodating to the fact that we want to make ourselves as adaptable to as much. But the original camera mounts being PL, let's just use PL in the Panavision mount, or even the BNCR mounts of the yesteryear, were built primarily to allow for a spinning mirror or a shutter mirror, like for instance your DSLR. So the mounts had a certain distance away to allow for the mirror, so the viewing system can see the image through the eyepiece. Well, now with the advent of modern digital cameras, the sensor becomes your live view eyepiece, so that we don't have to provide any type of mount that allows for mirror clearance. So you'll notice now mounts are starting to evolve down to basically dominant mounts with the shortest working distance possible. ARRI, for instance, has the LPL mount. At Panavision, we're adopting what's called the Panavision Primo 70 mount. And if you look into even like your consumer world, cameras, they're being branded with mounts with shorter and shorter working distances down below 20 millimeters. And what that does is the mounts are becoming larger throat diameters to allow for the larger diagonal and a greater spread of different types of like chief angle, meaning more telecentric, to something more vintagey, like a steep angle that enhances perspective distortion, and a shorter working distance, because the shorter the working distance and the closer I can get a lens to its true focal length, the less glass I have to add to it to pull the lens away from the film plane to allow the clearance of the mirror. So the lenses are becoming smaller as a result of the mounts being closer and larger. Their lenses are allowing me to get faster, and there's less elements. So that means is now the designers aren't worried so much about building a lens that's clearing an obstruction. Now they're worrying about how can I make a lens that gives me the most variation in compactness and speed and creativity. Also, too, mounts now are becoming more complex in that they're being packed up with metadata, meaning that they can record what focus position your lens was at, or what focal length you're using, or what stop you're using, and even so much so that now through post-image processing, meaning that the lens puts an image on the sensor, the camera interprets the image, sees the metadata coming from the mount, and it's actually start correcting for distortion or start correcting for aberrations, or in case of, for instance, like the Apple 13 phone, where it actually, through post-image processing, it can actually create more or less depth of field. That's something that you're going to see becoming more and more prevalent, and that has largely to do with these smart mounts that are coming around. So the mounts that are coming around now is they're going to be a much shorter flange depth, larger diameter, and probably what they call smart mounts that allow for this communication between the camera and the lenses.
Great. That's great information. I'm going to start with one of the questions here from the audience.
Okay.
Does Panavision allow people to rent or lease lens when seeking to achieve a particular effect? So I'm taking that to mean, do you, if I come to you with a certain, desired effect in the end, do you guys recommend certain lenses for that?
We do all the time. So a perfect gag that happens, let's just use one that just came up the other day, is they wanted the field of view of people, where they're looking through a peephole. And what they did is they said, hey, look, we have a scene where someone's looking through a peephole. They want to be able to see the audience. Do you have something we can do for that? And we said, yeah, we have plenty of stuff for that. What helps the most is if once we get the request, we'll ask, okay, do you have kind of idea how you want your people? Because some people want just the full distortion covering the whole frame. Some people want the peephole, the vignette. You see kind of an obstruction. Simple people think they want it wider or longer. So that's just one of many examples. In the case of other shows, we had a show just recently, which was, I think it was a student film. And what they wanted to do was have the POV of shooting through an SLR camera. So what they asked is, how do you have a piece of equipment? And it was a really low budget show. But what we did was we said, sure, what exactly do you want? He says, well, I wanted to make it look like it was coming from, say, an old Nikon still camera. So what we did is we made a relay system, which we have plenty of, and it's on the shelf. We found an old Nikon Fresnel ground glass. We put it in the image plane so that it basically photographed the look of shooting through a still lens, and they put whatever lens they want on there, and it was there to kind of give them the feel that they're shooting through a still lens. Another example is, more times than not, which happens on large tentpole, on student films, and it really, again, it's what it says, it just doesn't hurt to ask, is if someone was, I think they were drugged or they were drunk, and they wanted to convey the feeling of what their POV of looking drunk or drugged out was, and I forgot which one it was, but we have multiple lenses on the shelf that actually creates, this kind of a feel where the edges fall off with a lot of color. It's really wide, so you almost have this kind of weird, like you're floating type of feel. But the center is sharp or kind of sharp, and from there you can adjust it. And again, what happens is either a bracketing, we'll start with something, say, a little bit more conservative, and they'll direct us to something more aggressive, or they'll send us a screenshot of saying, this is stuff I've seen in the past. You have something that'll do that. And more times than not, we'll have something like that. And oddly enough, this isn't just province of the large budgeted shows. It's ironically, it's the shows with the smaller budgets or the student shows that give us the most ideas, because the large budget shows don't have the luxury of gambling on the studio's dime, where the smaller budget shows is they can take chances, and that's when they do all their experiments or commercials or music videos, and then they apply what they learned there with a little bit more confidence, and go ahead and roll the dice on a larger budget show. So I really want to emphasize the fact is it can't hurt to ask, because you'd be surprised what we already have on the shelf, and many times or not, it's just sitting there because it got used once, and then from there we can even tweak on that to give you that really specialty look. I mean, you'd be surprised how, I say within a week, we'll do at least 4 to 5 specialty shot lenses.
Great. The next question is, how does someone submit a request to Panavision to create a unique lens or lens effect, and what's the turnaround on that?
Okay, so I'm gonna answer that question backwards. The turnaround, so that's a moving target. So I love it when we get people that, rarely this happens, but they'll give us like a month. You know, they're doing pre-production, and they'll know that within the script that they'll come and ask us for something really specialized. The realities is we had a show just last week. It was a TV show, and they had to do this POV of a dog. They gave us 6 hours to come up with something. So they gave us the idea. We had 6 hours. We cobbled together 6 hours. It was a TV show, so it wasn't the biggest budget in the world. So again, it wasn't that. The way that came in is very simple. In the case of you want to go to your contact point, and in this case, it'll be Aaron, who's nice enough to host this, and he'll direct us, and he'll say, "Hey, look, I got this show." And Aaron can attest to the fact that he comes to us all the time asking, hey, what lens gives us this, or what lens gives the people? I think, in fact, wasn't it you, Aaron, just recently that asked about a peephole lens for one of your shows? And it really comes down to, you want to talk to your marketing rep. If you want, you can call Panavision and ask to speak to a marketing rep. You could talk to Aaron, and he'll get the request, and then from there they'll start directing you, because you'd be surprised how often this effect attachment probably already exists, unless it's something so crazy. And in that case, for instance, the doggy camera thing, I never heard of anything like this before, and we had to come up with something in 6 hours. And in some cases, for instance, on student films, they'll be doing a prep, and something will come up and built within like a couple hours for them to test.
Yeah, Dan, if you all can hear me again, just since you mentioned it, I thought I'd jump back in. So to speak to that, and it is one of my projects, and actually we were doing a bunch of tests today on that project with the WAVA, which is the wide angle viewing attachment, as well as a couple of super wide 8mm lenses. So we have some really cool different effects. We have some different solutions for that peephole effect. And I was just going to remind the audience of my email, nfp@panavision.com, because myself and the other reps here, to Dan's point, we're the ones to come to with all of those requests if you want to talk about a rental at all. And then, of course, when you get into your rental, we're happy to have those conversations with you, where we really go through your order to try to get the best camera system for your needs. And part of that, of course, will be a discussion of optics, which we would be the go-between at that point between any special requests for Dan and his special optics team, depending on what you need. And obviously, as Dan says, well, Dan put it very politically. I will just say they are obviously very, very, very busy back there and have a tremendous number of requests. So we always do the best we can to try to, as Dan put it very nicely when he says, I'll come to him and ask. And sometimes those requests are very urgent, as he says. So we try to ask nicely. But you can all definitely come and ask me and us.
So is it fair to say that the best approach to that would be to try to get your request in as early as possible and have some type of visual representation, if possible, to show you what exactly they're looking for?
That would be amazing. A picture's worth 1,000 words. I mean that's so used, that phrase, but it doesn't have to be a motion picture. It can be, you'd be surprised. It could be from a painting. It could be a still photo. Or it could be a collage of different ones. We just had someone drop off a collage today of just several photos, and as an aggregate of all these photos was the underlying theme he wanted the lenses to look like, and it was this 1980s kind of Norman Rockwell feel. And surprisingly enough, it was lenses we had with just a slight adjustment, but he was trying to describe it over the phone and then through a marketing rep. And then when we finally talked to the actual cinematographer, I said, well, can you send me a couple of images of what you want? And we asked a couple questions. He sent us a series of like 3 pictures. Like, oh my gosh, we had this. And we knocked it out like within 3 hours after that.
Great information. What about mobile filmmaking? I saw recently a video of Lady Gaga shot a video on the new iPhone. And she had these huge Primo lenses. They did some behind the scenes. Have you gotten a lot of requests for retrofitting your professional lenses to mobile filmmaking?
It's kind of different. Now this is gonna, to be honest with you, I see this kind of happening, especially with the related not too far from the iPhone 13 marketing blitz that just came out. The one thing that's really interesting is, since the lenses on the iPhone are so integrated to the phone, meaning that if I were to take a lens off an iPhone and photograph it, just to have the ability to, you would be really surprised how much distortion and fall off, because many of the attributes of those lenses are fixed within the camera and in the processing. Now, what I could see, to your point, is there's going to be a trend that was not too different as a possibility. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but what's going to maybe happen, especially with the accessibility of these sophisticated cameras, is that when the 2/3 inch digital came out, there was this tendency of these smaller cameras that they would relay the image, use the lens on, use the lens on the iPhone and relay it through an intermediate image. So use the iPhone not as the main taking lens, but as a relay lens, and then put a motion picture lens in front of that. So basically it's an extension of the phone, but you're using the characteristics of the main lens and letting the iPhone lenses relay that image to the iPhone. And that I could see happening. Now, quite honestly, I think that's something that's gonna possibly happen depending on the demand cycle of that. And then selfishly, I kind of don't want to do that as much. I'd rather give, have you do it just through an actual camera sensor that's on its raw sensor and put the lens on that, meaning as like, for instance, some of these new Red cameras that are coming out with these incredibly small, I think it's a Komodo or something like that it's called. It's an incredibly small box camera, and they're going to get smaller like Black Magic, and then put them on there without having to go through the hassle of a relay. But I do see what you just said is actually could fruition as a trend. And if that's the case, if someone is entrepreneur enough to kind of revisit the 2/3 relay, I think they can create quite an interesting niche.
Is that very similar to the old ground glass adapters that we had prior
exactly.
to?
100%. You nailed it.
Yeah, I've got one of those in my closet here, gathering lots of dust. So
Yeah, but it actually was kind of a cool way of making those 2/3 chips have a little bit of personality. And I can honestly see that becoming a really kind of interesting alternative. Again, I'm kind of from the more pure just because of the way I was raised. I could see it, but I also see the trend for camera sensors are going to get smaller and smaller, and the basically the camera is going to mount to the lens eventually, the motion picture lenses.
definitely. So we've got one last question here.
Okay.
The question is, Dan, you talked about interchanging analog lenses with digital cameras. Can the opposite be done by using an analog camera and incorporating a digital lens, or would that be more of a function of post-production?
No, it actually it honestly gets done. Now, the only thing that the main caveat of that is it's very one-sided street. You can always put an analog and a digital, but the opposite is tough because of clearance issues. And sometimes digital lenses are designed in a way that's not exactly leaving much clearance for an analog type system, meaning any type of obstruction in front of the captured medium. So just make sure that you kind of look at your due diligence, because what's interesting with the digital lenses sometimes is that if you take advantage of kind of the cascading effect of an analog system, especially when you process between generations, it's this kind of natural way of toning down the image. It's kind of like this built-in post built into it. And so starting with the digital lens that has either this intrinsic perfection to the image or lack of perfection image, because that digital lens has been set up to match the camera, so you're going to get interesting distortion and edge color and edge fall off, creates an image that, quite frankly, is very hard to create unless you make a very specialized lens. And what I'm meaning by a lens that's matched the camera, if you look at, for instance, some of the Micro Four Thirds camera lens, like the Olympus system, if you were to take that lens off and put it onto, for instance, a test bench, or put it on or capture it on an actual sensor that doesn't correct for it electronically through image processing, you'd be surprised how much distortion there is and how much fall off there is and the color. But that is probably one of the coolest tricks of breaking down an image. I mean, one of the coolest things I've ever seen in my life is I'm gonna get this wrong. Oh no, there's a company. If you look on eBay, there's these rodent stock X-ray lenses that were built literally for X-ray, and you can find on eBay for really cheap. And they're these incredibly fast lenses, are like f.7s, and they were designed for X-ray chips, which are incredibly small with short working distances. But if you macro them, you can make them macro out and cover larger sensors, and you have, since the lenses were designed for X-rays and they were being used in a way that they were never intended to, you get the most amazing, dreamy looking lenses. So much so that, and if you have a chance to just look up X-ray lenses, like rodent stock X-ray lens images. A ton of people experiment. There was a cinematographer by the name of Cameron Morgenthau, which I don't know, I guess I must have been drunk or something. I was just talking to him about it. And his next commercial is, "Hey, I want to take you up on those X-ray lenses." And I'm like, "What?" And so we bought a couple of the rodent stocks, which we still have in the back. We macroed them, and he used them in this insurance commercial of photographing a baby up close. And I tell you, it was some of the most amazing stuff. And to this day, even though Kramer's really moving up, he still talks about these X-ray lens stuff that we did. That was amazing. And on the same theme, what you just talked about of digital onto analog, analog onto digital, or lenses that that weren't designed specifically for visible light capture on analog or digital, is equally as impressive.
Definitely. I know I said that was the last question. We have one more.
No, I'm here. Yeah, no problem.
What are your thoughts around, or do you get many requests or modifications for using these Panavision lenses with focal reducers? the adaptive.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Really great question. Okay. These speed boosters or focal reducers are cool. So now the only problem with that is many of the focal reducers, especially for instance, there's a couple brands like for instance Metabones, which builds a really nice product there, is that it reduces the working distance so much that there's an obstruction thing where on some of the cameras, unless they're just camera sensor low pass, that when you put the focal reducer, it runs into it. So for instance, on an Alexa camera or a Sony Venice or a Monstro camera, the focal reducer, because it shortens the focal length so much, it actually runs into the camera and you can't get it on. But the theory of what a focal reducer does is incredible, because not only are you increasing the speed of the lens, you're actually reducing the aggregate aberrations into a much tighter compact. So you're doing a very legitimate thing. So I think focal reducing is a really cool thing. It's a great way of kind of increasing your inventory of lenses, but also it's altering the lenses, giving it kind of a new thumbprint. The only downside to it is it does have restrictions in the fact that you lose your diagonal coverage. And there is a component that the lens could potentially run into some of the more robust cameras, but the more simple cameras, I absolutely, I think it's a great thing. And there's limits of how many lenses you can, because I think you can't put too short of a focal length lens on a reducer because it's already so short that it just doesn't, it's not compatible.
Yeah. Great. So that's going to wrap it up for us. We definitely want to thank Dan and Aaron from Panavision for speaking with us today, sharing the information and knowledge. We want to thank the audience and everyone who tuned in. And, you want to watch this clip that's coming up about the Denton Black Film Festival that's coming in January 2022. And we certainly appreciate everyone who attended. Thank you for your time and have a great evening. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks very much. Thanks, Michael.
All righty.
Got no ass.